house? I don't see it anymore. On the motion. Here.
Okay, I'll try to take POF from CO. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, okay, great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Let's be very clear on setup. We can still, to a certain extent, talk about personal issues perfectly in terms of the literal sense. So if a person who has mental health because of personal issues goes to the doctor and talks about this, obviously the doctor will diagnose them and tell them you have personal issues. We can still talk about mental health being important. We can still do these type of things. But where we think this debate has delta and has trade-off is in terms of two things. Firstly, what types of messages people who are wondering if they have mental health problems will receive, and what better pushes them into searching therapy and meditation and these type of things. And second, how wider society, other people who don't have mental health problems but can give cash money, push for political capital changes in these type of things will influence. Those will be our two arguments. Let's get into the first argument. Why is it easier for you to opt in as a person who has problems? And I have to be sure, I have to be very clear. This happens usually at the beginning when you're experiencing some kind of symptoms, you're wondering about some kind of things where you ask yourself, maybe I have some type of people. It's 2022 after all, like people can know about this, etc. But why it is hard on their side of the house to be probed in these type of messages? Firstly, average people finds it very hard to disregard personal problems due to a number of structural reasons. Firstly, it's usually familial. Like most people have endured things, like for example, being beaten up by their parents, gaslighting and these type of things like I had. And you know what my parents told me in this particular thing? Only your mother and father love you without any regards in these particular moments. And now that I'm an old person in front of you standing right here, I gaslight myself because I internalized this particular thing. That yes, it is impossible for my parents to have done all the horrible things like scream at me, lower my confidence, beat me up, all these type of things. But also it requires a level of introspection which is hard to accept. That these things actually happen to you. That you have actually gone through these problems in these particular things. That it's very problematic for you to take. But you know what's even more problem? Because people choose the path of least resistance in many of these cases. Because it's easy, right? This is basically evolutionary mechanism for us to survive, right? Do the easy thing in this particular case. Which means that people usually bury these things under the rug in this particular case, right? They think that it's not that big a problem. They pretend it doesn't happen in this particular case. So far, you inject these people with these type of messages, they will never be able to be co-opted on their side of the house. But second reason is in certain cases associated with personal choices. Like for example, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol, all these type of things that influence your mental capacity in many of these cases that make you stressed to do this particular case. But why does this change on our side of the house in terms of social? Number one, other factors are external to your control. What does this mean? This means that this is something objective that you can see in many of these cases. Like this is the example. We all know how social media fucks up our brain, right? Because it causes stress in many of these cases where we look at our likes and then we look at the other person's like this was better looking man than me in this particular case, and we go, wow, why don't I have these likes in this particular case? But also other things, how stressful our job is in this particular case. How, for example, if our town is polluted, and how this influences that, or it's something that you can, how you can see in this particular case and can visualize and can say this, but it's also not associated with the personal biases that we talk to you about. Because you have no personal bias for factors that are outside of control. You can internalize this, say, I was a victim in this particular case. It is something problematic that is done to me. It was outside my control in this particular case. And note, maybe to a certain extent, you may doubt that this is the real factor in this particular case, but we don't care, because it's an easy enough message for you to internalize. So even if you, for the first time, say, oh yes, external factors, you go to therapy, and then the dude tells you, no, it's actually not external factors, it's your personal thing, you have already been hooked in this particular case, you only make the first step, so if you're able to, which is the thing that's hard. But second reason is that it gives you an enemy that you can see in this particular case. Like the evil corporation is making you work in this particular case. Like the co-worker that's out constantly bullying you in this particular case. Or your high school kid that bullied you in this particular case. Or that the lack of the government, that this makes people angry. This rouses them up in this particular case. This makes them co-opt that they were victims of these problematic things. That they have necessarily felt negative emotions that they can put to them. Why is this a tipping point? Critical mass. Because on our side of the house, many people would like to speak out of these particular things because the barrier of entry is lower. It is easier for you to say, I'm a victim of the corporation. It is easier for you to say, I have been a victim about external factors in this particular case. It is hard for you to tell other person, yes, this is the trauma that I went through. This is how my parents gaslight me, beat me up in this particular case. This is all the personal shit that I went through. So more people quantitatively speak out. Even if message is not particularly the best, right? The most compelling story, more speak out. And when more people talk about these particular things, that's when it is normalized. That's when people tell themselves, okay, if so many people are talking about this particular thing, then maybe I have these problems as well. Maybe I should go to therapists. Maybe I should try this meditation stuff out. Maybe I should do this point, it should be the thing that you should weigh highest. Because, one, it's the most certain impact in this particular case. People are taking the step to go to therapy in this particular case for them doing this. But second, it's the path to them changing them. And maybe you won't get rid of 100% of your trauma, but you get rid of the trauma to an extent to which your life can be coped, right? For you not receiving panic attacks in this particular case. For you having maybe a bit more confidence in this particular case. Maybe reconciling some of the bad things for this sort of thing. So this is why you should weigh this argument highest. Before I continue to the second argument, yes, Yo.
A social focus says that you are depressed because you're poor. If you know that your depression is caused by your poverty, why would you go pay more money to see a mental health expert?
But no, dude, that's not the case. That's super unnuanced. Because you could have been depressed poor and you could have money right now, right? Like the conditions would still work. But it's not just poor things, right? It's also other factors in this particular case. You could be rich and still be manipulated by social media. You could be rich and still be manipulated by evil corporation. I reject this characterization straight off the bat. Now, why is it easier to make other people who don't have problems believe that these problems are important in this particular case? First, it's something that they have experienced and it's something easy for you to do. Like even if you don't go full having mental problems in this particular case, you have experienced negative emotion from social media, you have experienced negative emotion from work, or even if you haven't experienced it, you can visualize it, right? Because we have multiple tools of visualization. Movies, novels, we have conversations between each other for this particular case. So it is something that people can visualize. But secondly, it also works with other forces that exist to push this narrative. Socialists, communists, other social movements that exist can cooperate and hybrid between each other in order to push this particular narrative, so you increase the total amount of capital in terms of messaging you do in this particular case. So this way, average guy who doesn't have such mental problems thinks that mental problems are a real issue and don't go, oh, that's not a real issue in this particular case. When they're able to co-opt characterization that is more logical to them, when that is something believable to them in this particular case. On their side, this is harder to happen because the same barriers that we explained to happen to these people as well, who want to believe that their family is good, who want to believe that, how do you say, their individual choices do not impact this in this particular case. This means that when these people, the wider society, gets these types of messages, they're more likely to donate money to such mental health causes. They want to help these particular things. They're more likely to pressure corporations and governments to change their policies in terms of doing this particular case, to allocate more money, more funding, so we increase the access in terms of macro scale on our side of the house as well. Voice is bad, but for little Rumen, please give it to open government.
Thank you very much for that very fine speech. And now I invite the Leader of Opposition to open the case for opening up. Hear, hear.
Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. We think that it's funny that OG tries to weasel out a lot of the personal stuff that they lose on their side by saying that we can have it all. I don't think they can have it all. A couple of things that I don't agree with their setup. Firstly, I think there is a broader shift in, for example, how psychologists talk about therapy and like mental health issues and how this is taught in universities. Because on their side, it probably looks like you have a higher focus on things like courses about how societal factors affect people's mental health, and this being talked about in like conferences where like psychologists go to and whatnot. And this comes at the expense of talking about the nuances of personal behavior, at the expense of that additional cognitive behavioral therapy class, at the expense of talking about like more intricate nuances of how neuroscience works and why you can't generally prescribe SSRIs to every single person that has a mental health problem. So I think there is a trade-off in how psychologists approach mental health on their side, with focusing a lot more on societal issues. Secondly, though, I think this also changes how individuals talk to you and what you see on the internet and online. If everyone else tells you that the reason why you are depressed is because of your specific situation, and your friends tell it to you as well, then that's what you will blame your specific situation for. 4 responses to their case, though. No, thank you. Firstly, they say that other factors that are external to you are easier to visualize, i.e. you being poor and whatnot. I don't think this is the case, because external factors oftentimes come in the form of statistics. The fact that there's numbers, for example, like income and like what income does to people's mental health and whatnot. When you compare this to you like thinking about your own experiences, the memory of a person gaslighting you, and what that has done to you, I think it's much easier to visualize your own personal experiences and then be able to more directly pinpoint where the issue is coming from. Secondly, though, they say that it's much easier to say that I was a victim of like something happening in the environment that happened personally, right? I just think this is what the motion does for us, because when you have a first focus on talking about personal history, then the motion also normalizes talking about personal history. But I also think that there has already been a shift towards that somewhat in the status quo, right? Like we see people sharing those stories online and whatnot, people sharing this in this room, because I assume a lot more people will talk about. I also got beaten by my parents, by the way. So like this is something that is being normalized, right? Thirdly, though, they say that you can change the environment that you can like suddenly seek therapy when you are aware that this is happening because of the environment. Again, I'm not sure that this is the case, because if you believe that the environment is the cause of your specific mental health issue, then I'm not sure why you working on yourself and going into therapy will help you. I think instead you would probably think that you should change the environment to do that you probably lose hope because changing the environment is extremely difficult. Lastly, they talk about why people, what effect this will have on like other people and how they will get like more funding and whatnot. I think this is symmetric because they talk about how you can get things like the visualization of like environmental factors in movies. We can get the same thing with movies of like how personal issues affect you. And then they also talk about how you can get like co-op movements. I think we can also co-opt every leftist movement to support talking about personal issues, right? And then they say like you can get more funding for resolving the environmental issues. In the same way, we can get like more funding for therapists to subsidize therapy so that people talk about their personal issues a lot more. I think their case is up. Bringing then one argument about why on our side you get more individualized solutions and why those are better for targeting people's mental health. Firstly, we'll prove why you get better individualized solutions in terms of capabilities. Because note that firstly, it is very difficult for people to change the environment. So if they are told that it is the environment the reason like behind their sadness, this is something that is very difficult. You cannot just stop being poor. You cannot stop being discriminated, right? And then overall, like societally, it's very difficult to actually convince governments like massively change societal situations just because of a narrative of what this does about to people's mental health. I think comparatively, it is much easier for people to change how they like perceive their own mental health and how their own personal experiences relate to that. This looks like, for example, talking about your own family history and trying to resolve that by like seeking like the root causes of your problematic behavior, because this was something that you saw from your parents and therefore you replicate this, or when other people give you this specific form of like affection, you know that you were tied to them even though you know that they are not that for you, and you being able to realize that. No, thank you. Secondly, it probably looks like engaging in cognitive behavioral therapy, analyzing the way in which your behaviors guide your everyday actions, how that affects your preferences and reinforces other bad behaviors. Which parts of like conversations with others are you failing at and how you can change this. But also thirdly, it can just look like telling people to like stop smoking weed if they have a predisposition to psychosis, because that's what weed does to them, right? And this is them like being able to take responsibility for that. But that this is everything that people can do, and something that that's much easier than to make them do on our side, because they have better capabilities to do so. Before I continue, sure.
If you're shaped by your environment and you cannot give a rationalization of why you have this personal behavior, won't you just stop going to therapy and do all that things because you cannot see the reason behind it?
No, I think you can, because let's say you can like live in like an extremely like poor, like you live in a poor area because of that like high unemployment correlates with alcoholism, that eventually spills over to like abusive parents and whatnot, right? You can on their world say this was because you were in a poor environment. On our world, you can talk about like the way in which your parents interacted with you and how that traumatized you and how to get over that. I think you can do the same thing then on like both sides of that way, right? But probably a lot better on our side because you actually visualize everything a lot better, right? Why do you have better incentives, however, to solve everything on our side? Firstly, because I think on their side gets biased therapists. Based on the framing that I gave at the top of my speech, this looks like therapists being told that they should focus more on environmental causes. This looks like when people from similar environments go to a specific therapist, like from similar income backgrounds or from like similar racial backgrounds that are facing similar forms of discrimination, the therapist will probably try to actively look for those commonalities because that's what they have been partially taught during school, and therefore maybe neglect some of the nuances and the differences between those two individuals, and that results in worse therapy because they don't provide like solutions that are as tailored to the specific problems of the individuals, right? It's like intuitive that if I prescribe two very similar situations to different individuals, it's a worse outcome. Secondly, though, I think it looks like blanket solutions. If you feel like you cannot work on people's individual problems, you're more likely to do things like overprescribe antidepressants. And this is something that's a huge issue, because antidepressants work beyond the placebo effect on only 15% of the people who consume them. Most people with milder symptoms of mental disease can do just as well with more personalized therapy, but you don't get that when you say that everything is the issue of the environment, therefore not much to focus on personally, just I'll give you the pill, and this is the best thing I can do, because I as a therapist also cannot change the environment. Thirdly, though, you also change the incentives of people and how they approach their own mental health. Because on their side, you get like the stereotypical leftist weed smoker that like focuses on like how capitalism is causing their mental health issues. They might be correct, and then they smoke weed and like increase their chance of getting psychosis because of that. On their side, on our side, you can tell people that it is like because of their drug consumption, even though there's like overarching other factors that the person can change anyway, but we we actually tell them to change those specific parts of themselves that they actually have control over. So on our side, people are much more willing to take their life into their own hands and try to change the best that they can. That's why you vote for a vote.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Ready? Sorry. Yeah, I have the voice thing, so I'm just gonna compose it here, so we can create a more personal experience, personal topics, and we can solve them together. I think there are two important questions in this round. Firstly, on access to therapy in the first place, and I'm going to give you some reasons as to why that is the case. And second of all, on critical mass and where do we achieve it better, so we can create the access in the first place, create the opportunity, and also lower the barrier of entry for you to actually get the help that you particularly need. Before that, just to be clear, when you go through a therapy session and the whole process of doing therapy and things like that, it's always going to be an individualistic approach. So, first of all, therapy is and psychology is a science that is very old. It has obviously different types of things that are still going to be looked at, particularly in university and things like that. What is important here to understand is when I go to my therapist, they're not going to, in our side of the house, completely not ask me about my personal life, not really delve into the reasons why I am the person that I am. It's just more going to be about what is the societal narrative created of the reasons why, but also I can go to the also societal aspect of it in the first place. So we can never completely change that on their side of the house. I think the second here that I want to say that even in the worst case, they're right. In certain cases there is this trait. People that find it very hard, and many people are not going to completely succeed by finding out the reason and the very deep personal issues that they have and solve them completely, things like that. But still, for a much larger group in society, the things that we achieve on our side of the house impact many, many people. And they alleviate a lot of the everyday pain that these people experience. If I'm a person with deep psychological trauma, because I have experienced something bad, such as abuse and things like that, if I have a better environment in my workplace, if I have a better environment when I go to social media, it's going to impact my daily life, even if they don't completely solve my deep personal issues like that. But thirdly, a lot of these things are connected. I do not agree. I would like to, toxic behavior in relationships, let's say toxic men and things like that, is connected by how we perceive women in our society. People in poverty that are more susceptible to addiction do tend to, if they are addicted to, basically abuse a lot of people in their family and things like that. It's not always the case. But it is in fact that there is some societal factors and there are additional reasons as to would like to look into those particular things. Now, on access, I think this is pretty simple. We would like to get more people to go to that first therapy session and continue going to that particular therapy session. And I think on their side of the house, you're far more likely to be an outcast or somebody who is one of the few that goes to that particular session. Why? Because the reasons are deeply personal and nobody talks about it and it's different for everyone. On our side of the house, we achieve three specific things. First and more importantly, Ruben already explained this, it's about the normalization of, we all have this problem. We've all gone through that experience. It is normal to feel like you have a mental health issue because of the environment that you have. Many of these cases might even be complete bullshit or overreactions, but many of these people can still benefit from a therapy session in many of these cases. But also, this increases the demand for such services, which is crucial in this particular route, because it gets overall access to the people with the deepest issues, but also the people with not so deep issues, but still issues that they want to solve. Meaning that more and more people seek out online resources, online things like that. Therapists overall, like more people, because there is a more demand, will actually go and basically finish therapy, specialize in these particular things, and help a lot of these people. Which means that when I am a person with deep psychological issues, when I go out in the world, I take the first step because it's more normalized, but then I also have the access to do that first step. Because maybe my employer paid for my therapist, maybe we have a therapist on demand in the workplace, or maybe there are more options online that are very cheap for me to access to in the first place before I continue the process.
If the reason why you're depressed is because your parents beat you, why are you blaming social media or capitalism? It's the wrong cause, right?
Look, and this is very important. In many of the cases, you do not know why you're depressed. You do not know why you experience panic attacks. You do not know why you experience anxiety when you go into a crowd and things like that. Many of these cases are not like one link to another. This is why we need you to get you in that therapy room in the first place. We achieve it far more on our side of the house when we remove many of the first level barriers for you to get there. This is how we help the most people possible. I cannot tell you that we're going to solve all these people's issues, but we can do a much better, we can create a much better environment for them to live in. And in many of the cases, you don't have to have the deepest psychological trauma for you to be an important person in this round. Like maybe I am not broken inside, but I still have some issues that I would like to have the access to fixing in the first place. And critical mass is achieved on our side of the house. All of the reasons Truman gave you about basically the interpersonal experience versus the external experience. We essentially lower the empathy gap that is required for people to believe that therapy is something normal, and for people to believe that they should accept more of it in society and more people to go. So even if I'm a person that is fairly privileged, exactly of privileged background, I may never understand what it is to be abused in the family, but I can see that like as many other people do experience anxiety on the workplace, do experience maybe panic attacks because of my own personal issues. And more of these people, if they can buy and normalize the conversation, this is where we get to the point where the people who need it the most actually gain the opportunities for access to the therapy session that they need. I think lastly, I think this essentially means that all the things that we talked about, co-opting of movements, pressuring governments and things like that, essentially means that more and more people will push their politicians to talk about it, will make it a big point of view. And things like that. Look, finally, I think that essentially it helps to fight a lot of the stereotypization that we have. Because currently, if it's very personalized, you are seen as this broken person that have been dealt a bad hand. On our side of the house, you're far more able to accept that you're one of many people with mental health issues. Normalize getting these people jobs in the field workplace, normalize them getting the help that they particularly need, even if it's not the right cause. I would prefer people to believe the patriarchy is the culprit of their mental health only if that gets them to get an actual therapy session. So fucking happy to propose this one.
Thank you very much, that speaker. And now I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue on this case.
Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. Movies discussing a narrative as a cause of a mental illness, or your personality, or your personal story or history, or in movies, is symmetric. If they want to base their case on being basically like you now start to normalize it, or people start to like create demand for therapy sessions, all of the mechanisms that they talk about are completely symmetric because of their own, because of the mechanisms that they say this. Yeah. A couple of extremist responses before I continue. Firstly, they say that it's easier for people to start opting in because firstly you have this internalization of your own is pretty hard, and secondly you feel out of control, so you're likely to do that. Two reasons why it's false. Firstly, on internalization. Notice that it becomes a lot more easier to realize that something has happened to you when you have had that personal experience given to you, right? Notice, it's probably likely that I start realizing if I was beaten in my childhood, that is the reason why I start beating people. Because I didn't like it myself and now I want to project it on other people. Notice it's way harder for you to realize that capitalism is the cause where you start to, like, let's say for example, steal things. Because it's harder to like rationalize, like, what the fuck is capitalism even, right? But secondly, I'll take you in control, right? Notice, the reason why people start to take the first step is because they believe that they have the capacity to change. The capacity to change and the perception of it is a prerequisite for you to act. Notice, feeling out of control outlocks the vast majority of the case, because people never think that they can defeat capitalism, because they don't think they can actually beat the poor surroundings that they actually have. No, thank you. And secondly, now on their model, they basically just want to use this for opt-in, right? And then they can use the personal approach to solve these issues. Why is the focus in this debate? Because it's a debate on the focus, not the model that they are actually defending. Firstly, on aggregate, they would be spending the vast majority of the time dealing with the issues on a personal level. And secondly, notice that the vast majority of the actual therapy happens like at the end stages of it, right? The reason for that is because therapists usually need like a lot of time to actually start understanding the person in the first place, right? After that, only that crucial mechanism through which they can be healed can happen. Insofar as the case is about social narratives works only at the beginning, it's highly likely that the model is flawed in the first place. OG is out. Let's start with, let's go with CG, right? They basically say that it's hard for you to rationalize these issues, right? Sort of like derivative of what their opening says. Why the converse is true. Firstly, realistically, people self-diagnosing is a bad idea, and they usually do it really fucking bad, right? Like, notice, at the point at which you have a therapist, it's likely that the vast majority of your rationalization or internalization of what the problem is stems from your therapist. Alex tells you that insofar as that therapist talks about your, for example, personal issues, it's highly likely because of the metrics that I've explained before, right? That you start to rationalize it way better because you're because now your for example, therapist, is forced to put the focus on your personality rather than the narrative. No, thank you. Even if that's not the case, notice that rationalizing the events that have happened to you is way easier because you have the experience over them, right? An intuition pump. It's hard to rationalize, for example, what morality means, right? Or what the concept actually looks like. But at the point at which you see that you don't like to be hit, right? So probably one of the moral causes or the principles is do not hate anyone because it's painful, right? It becomes a lot more easier to grasp that only exclusively on the opposition side. Then they lastly say, which is kind of like a flip on their model, right? That, oh, notice, if you talk about socioeconomic factors, you still have this personal experience. Yes, but notice, no thank you, the focus means that the vast majority of this happens in, is explained through socioeconomic narratives. Why is that bad? Because you lose the crucial nuance that people usually have on top of that, right? For example, an intuition. If you have two people, right, which express the same symptoms, right? But notice, for example, because of disenfranchisement, right? But the first person does that because they were bullied in childhood, but the second one because, for example, they were cheated on, right? It's highly likely that the underlying issue stems from different things, right? For example, violence or lack of trust, right? Notice, on their side of the house, it's likely they would try to heal that person in a symmetrical, even the same way. No, thank you. On our side of the house, it's likely that the therapist would be able to distinguish what the difference is and give them personal treatment, which is way better. Why is this nuance crucial? Notice because it probably allows you to empathize with the patient in the first place, right? It's highly likely that the thing that you hide from your mental illness are the small bits, for example, that you don't want to talk about everyone, right? Because when someone asks you, why are you depressed? I know capitalism and stuff like that. No, thank you. You're highly unlikely to tell them, look, when I was, for example, 18, a person cheated on me really heavily, right? Or did some stupid shit to me, right? Hence I'm now depressed. I think it's highly likely they'd lose that, and they never are able to access that person's actual personality. Before I continue on my extension, I'll take you later. Basically, firstly, why is assuming lack of the capacity on both sides of the house to change the surroundings of that person? I'm going to explain to you by actually trying to change your perspective of your surroundings, meaning acceptance, is way harder and less likely than actually changing the perception of yourself on our side of the house. why does that matter? Two things here. Firstly, if we prove that it is the case, right, we're likely to prove to you that we can have a targeted therapy more likely in our side of the house. We're likely to save more people. But secondly, notice, no thank you, we prevent the transition to mental illness on the sense that you're unlikely to transmit it, for example, to your children, right? Because notice what the difference in the narrative looks like. On their side of the house, you as a parent are just telling your kids we live in shit. I don't know how to change that. On our side of the house, you look look, I made some bad things happen to me. It's unlikely that those things can happen to you. Hence, it's unlikely that you have to develop the same depression that I did, right? Notice it stems to self-control. Before I start on that, I'll take a closing.
Therapists are educated professionals who know what they're doing and whose income depends on giving individualist solutions. Therapy approaches likely don't change on the other side of the house.
Yeah, they do, because you're starting to focus on the personality rather than trying to explain every single depressed person through a social narrative. No, thank you. Sit down, I won't take any more, right? Self-control, let's start about that, right? Notice the perceived capacity of you to change your surroundings is the prerequisite for you to start acting. Insofar as you believe on their side of the house, right, the world is way bigger than you, and you're never going to be able to defend capitalism. Look at all the depressive poets, right, who say fuck, I'm fucked, right? It's highly likely to look on their side of the house like that. On our side of the house, when you see that you yourself are the master of your fate, which is likely to happen if the therapist starts to focus on you rather than the surroundings, you're likely to take that first step. Hence, we solve the problem of their opting in and buying, right? But secondly, perception feedback. Notice at the point at which I'm starting to sense that I can quit smoking, it's highly likely that it transmits further. Be me sensing, for example, that I can now quit drinking or stuff like that, right? Notice it's crucial that when you empower yourself as a personality and internalize the effects as though you have control over them, it's highly likely that you yourself can start to trickle down that feedback loop and start to solve your own problems, right? Notice, insofar as that's the case, it's highly likely that this focus alleviates the necessity for therapists to actually spend that much time with people. This is what Alex on top of what Alex tells you about, right? But for example, about developing drugs that are targeted to specific personalities, for specific genome types, right? Rather than just focusing on look, the narrative's never beatable, right? Your thought start to accept it. Insofar as that's unlikely, insofar as we solve the opt-in issue, and almost outside of the house is likely to help more people. Oh.
Thank you very much to the speaker and to all four speakers. An excellent front half. Now I invite the member of government to open up the back half of this debate. Here, here.
Just a second. Okay. So, start thinking 3, 2, 1. As a person with ADHD, I really fucking hate this round because it presumes that society is just a blank slate and this narrative just exists in the abstract. But there are, firstly, intrinsic tendencies for people to construct narratives, and secondly, competing narratives that either magnify this particular narrative that is going to be the dominant one in society, or make others worse. I'm going to talk about, firstly, why this is a necessary dominant narrative to counterbalance intrinsic ways in which people think and exist in other narratives, and secondly, why we concede to opening opposition. In the vast majority of cases, you won't be able to change your mental health situation, which is why the metric should be coping mechanisms. Let's begin by firstly talking about why this is a necessary counterbalance. I would say that firstly, on a purely individualistic basis, there are multiple reasons as to why people are intrinsically focusing hyper on the individual. This is firstly because of the empathy gap. That is to say, people who are, for example, neurotypical, have a fundamentally different experience of the world as compared to a person who's neurodivergent, or a person who's extremely has a fundamental perception and lens through which they view the world as compared to a person who's currently happy or is generally well off. Which is why people, when they hear about mental health issues, tend to say that those are moral failings or character flaws or you're just not doing enough as compared to everything else. I would say that secondly, in the vast majority of cases, it's very hard for people to conceptualize how multiple intrinsic and complicated societal factors actively connect to you somehow being affected.
But thirdly, in many cases, the people that are expressing their own issues with mental health have a tendency to have a very low self-esteem, because if they're unable to function normally, if in the vast majority of cases there's a lower socioeconomic status, if they're more prone to be depressed, if they're unable to survive the 9 to 5 because they're more prone to have sensation, emotional dysregulation or accessory overload or other mental health conditions, this is more likely for them to be excessively negative towards them and to blame themselves, which means that this narrative pushes towards the hyper-individualism. But I would say that secondly, existing societal narratives are also pushing for us to be hyper-individualistic in absence of this dominant narrative about mental health. I would say that first, in the vast majority of cases, we already have massive narratives like the American dream, moral responsibility, or like on a more personal level, the Bulgarian grind that you have to always work harder, that actively make people believe that they should actively be working to change their lifestyle, to change their habits, to change their mindset, to actively ensure that they reach success. Again, hyper-individualistic. But I would say that secondly, there are a lot of pragmatic incentives for the people on top to perpetuate individualistic narratives, right? They want to say that Jeff Bezos perpetuates the narrative that he's the most successful because he wants to get all the credit, he wants that specific legacy, and they don't want us to question the current socio-economic system, which is why they often focus on hyper-individualistic narratives, that they're responsible for their own wealth, and that we shouldn't be having great distribution because this is not fair, this is against the hard work of people. What is the bottom line of this? Firstly, for us to have any meaningful discussion, we must consider both sides. They are both individual and external factors that affect you. Currently, in absence of this, it is heavily skewing towards one side. But secondly, and this engages with opening the opposition, the alternative is not you considering that maybe your family issues are kind of the issue, but you excessively skewing that every single facet of your specific individual life is actively responsible for this. On our side, we concede and we're completely fine with that. We are fine with you believing that 90% of the case you cannot change anything, but at least people have an intrinsic desire to be better, so we are fine with defending those 10% of cases in which people feel that they have agency and want to improve themselves. Second point of extension. Why? No. Why, in the vast majority of cases, we should focus on coping instead of trying to resolve the underlying mental health issues. I think there are three very important reasons for this. The first one is that many mental health issues, in the vast majority of cases, are just mainly unfixable. That is to say, people who suffer from ACD, ADHD, are like have structural differences. For example, people with depression, they don't produce enough serotonin. People with ADHD have differences in their prefrontal cortex. I can give like 1,000 examples. Secondly, those people, even if they are not inherently different, are genetically predisposed to episodes in which their mental health deteriorates much faster. That is to say, people who are genetically predisposed to panic attacks, anxiety, and episodes of depression experience them much more often and much more intensely. But I would say that thirdly, in the vast majority of cases, that those people are in the minority, which means they can never reach a tipping point to change society. Most people are neurotypical, most people don't experience the most severe cases of mental health issues, or they don't experience it to that degree. Or secondly, by my previous analysis, the vast majority of people don't have an interest of changing socioeconomic systems, because firstly, people have a bias towards risk averseness, preserving the status quo. Secondly, those that are currently in power don't recognize those issues or actively are profiting from them. For example, people perpetuating problematic social media algorithms to actively insulate people, make them more lonely, so they can get even more profit. Which means in the vast majority of cases, those conditions intrinsically, but those in which society operates, are unfixable, which is why we try to focus on coping mechanisms that are guaranteed to help every single person and are much more certain to help them on a micro level as compared to everything else. And here I want to make the way very clear. OG says we want to change society to political capital because those societal issues are very problematic and they are the root cause. We say a lower burden. We believe that we want to change the way in which we actively interact with them. Why is this likely to be the case? This is the first coping mechanism. We cannot instantly change your situation, but on aggregate, we have more discussion as to how the specific external factors actively affect your well-being. That is to say, you're more likely to have media, people sharing their stories, and the active encouragement of research and data to analyze the interaction between the individual and society. It generally means that over the long term, people are better able to realize that you should focus more on their social life because their loneliness is a precondition for them to get massively depressed. Or they focus that they shouldn't be going into certain sources, corporate jobs, because it can trigger all episodes of like mental health situation. Before I continue on that point.
Someone who buys into the American dream or the Sigma male grind set won't accept that they're mentally ill because of capitalism, but more likely that it's because of genes or past relationships.
Some of them won't, but on your side, all of them won't, considering that you are pushing the narrative towards the hyper-individualistic one. Even if this is valid, this is severe, just only mitigates. Secondly, if they are unable to change their circumstances, we want people to not feel in control, to realize that in the vast majority of cases, they are not in control. This is massively important for two reasons. Firstly, because in the most vulnerable moments, when you're having a panic attack, when you're at the very bottom and having a depressive episode, we don't want people to feel horrible about themselves. That's to say, to actively shame themselves, to guilt trip themselves, to gaslight themselves that they could have done better, and to question why they can just change their minds. But secondly, and this is very crucial, in the vast majority of cases, people go through social interactions. They go to friends and relatives. This is severely worse on their side, because firstly, if society is hyper-individualistic, you put all the blame on yourself. You are ashamed, you feel guilt, and you don't want to share to other people, thus you isolate yourself. But secondly, even if you want to share, if society is just, friends and relatives are constantly asking, how is therapy going, are you working out, are you changing your mind, this necessarily means that you don't get the necessary validation, which makes you feel horrible, but also makes you less likely over the long term to go to those people. For all those reasons, false.
Thank you very much, that speaker. And now I'd like to invite the member of opposition. Here, here.
If you are told that the reason why you're depressed or anxious is because you're poor, or because of social media, or because you're a racial minority, you're not going to go to therapy because your depression has already been explained to you. People go to therapy because they're trying to understand themselves and identify the cause of their misery. When you give them such a simple and generic explanation, such as you are depressed because you don't have enough money to spend on food, then this removes the main impetus in which people go into the therapist's office in the first place, to uncover the mystery and the enigma, which is themselves. Given that people already find it difficult to muster the courage to enter the therapist's office, we think it makes it significantly harder for the government bench to get people in the office in the first place when they are already given such simple narratives to explain their anxiety or depression. The other side says the problem isn't you. It's not because of the chemical balance in your head. It's not because you suffered trauma or because you were beaten as a child. The other side says just blame society, and the reason why you're miserable is because of capitalism. Two very simple areas in my speech. The first, I want to discuss the outcomes of a social focus, and then the second, naturally, I want to discuss the outcomes of a personal focus. What does a focus on social factors look like? It says that if you are in X circumstance, you should have Y mental disorder. Such as if you are someone who's poor, you probably suffer from anxiety. If you are someone who's a racial minority, you therefore suffer depression in this regard. Why is this understanding of mental illness extremely non-specific and leads to a bad outcome? I have three things I want to discuss under this. The first is that it leads to generalizations. It says that all people in X demographic group ought to have this mental health issue. This can be flipped, which means that it denies access to people. If you are saying that all Asians or all African Americans, because they are discriminated and because they suffer from this socioeconomic circumstance, means that they are unstable, or means that they are dangerous, or means that they are anxious. We think that people are more likely to prejudge certain groups that suffer from specific circumstances and say that these groups are depressed and these groups are anxious. That leads to more discrimination that happens ironically. But the second is that it tells people who might otherwise be okay that they ought to be depressed because they are predisposed to a certain condition. A poor person might be really happy and not depressed or anxious at all, but their side prescribes them by saying that because you suffer from these socioeconomic circumstances, you ought to be anxious and you ought to be depressed, which means that individuals have no agency in deciding their own mental health illness when society tells them that because you are in this circumstance, you ought to feel a certain way. Second impact, it excludes people not in this circumstance. This is a demographic of people that were left out in this debate. Because all other houses in this room presume that people fit into that category where they suffer from certain socio-economic discrimination. But the truth is that not all circumstances are equal. Many people are part of the racial majority, they earn a decent living, or they live in a developed country, which means that there's no socio-economic explanation for their unhappiness. There's no discrimination, there's no poverty that explains why they're so depressed and so miserable. What are the outcomes of this? The first, supposedly privileged people, people who have comfortable standard of living that live in the developed world, cannot access mental health help because they are told that you shouldn't be depressed because there's no socio-economic explanation for for it. Why is this a bad thing? The first is that even if they are relatively more privileged people, they are still individuals that suffer subjectively and they ought to be able to have their misery validated and their mental health issues addressed. Certain demographics on their side of the house are structurally locked out because they do not have a socio-economic explanation for their misery. But secondly, and this directly engages with opening government, the privileged people are the ones with capital. They are the ones with enough money they can invest in things like research and development into better health or mental health issues. All of the privileged people are told and gaslighted that they shouldn't have depression because they are privileged and don't have socio-economic discrimination. Therefore, they do not engage with the mental health industry, which means that you have less money and investments pouring into the mental health industry. But the second harm of exclusion is that people end up having to prove that you are poor enough or that you are discriminated enough in order to suffer from certain mental health issues. This leads to the oppression Olympics, a race to the bottom, where people invalidate the suffering of other people. You're not poor enough to be able to feel this depressed because you can still make your rental payment. You're not that discriminated as a racial minority because this racial minority has it much worse. This leads to people not speaking up about their issues because they feel as if their socio-economic oppression isn't sufficient enough for them to feel depressed or feel anxious. This is where people internalize their own mental health issues, they internalize their own oppression, and they blame themselves and gaslight themselves for saying, I'm not discriminated that badly, I'm not that poor, why am I still so depressed? On their side of the house, they invalidate their own depression, but the last thing is that people feel helpless because you externalize powers to you externalize blame to powerful institutions and your work of agency and the ability to change your own circumstance. Opening government says this is a good thing because you will anger people to get political change. But the point is that there will always be social and political capital to get change because people understand that discrimination brings about suffering and people are generally, there's a trend towards progressivism and people want to get rid of discrimination. So this isn't the tipping point. To tell people that oppression also leads to mental health disorders isn't a tipping point. It doesn't add additional critical mass to an already very strong social movement that believes that we should end discrimination. Closing government says that there are existing incentives to focus on the individual. The first is that this is not true. The empathy gap means that epistemically you'll never understand how other individuals feel and therefore you have no incentive to enter each and every person's mind to understand the way in which they suffer from their mental health issues. But secondly, people already logically understand that being poor or discriminated makes you sad and there's no need to have an additional focus on it. At this point in my speech, the conclusion is that the prerequisite for the government case is getting awareness of critical mass. We have proven for the majority of people that are locked out of this focus because they do not suffer from socio-economic factors and discrimination. Before I move on, yes, QI.
You seek therapy or a doctor because of the symptoms that you have, not the reason that you think is the solution for this.
Yeah, and then the cure on your side is that you want social movements to help you overthrow the government, then you don't actually go to the therapist's office because you feel like, I'll be happy if I wasn't poor, and then you want to vote for a political party instead that makes you not poor. Now let's talk about the outcomes of a personal focus. The comparative of personal history means that people identify the cause of mental health issues in their own individual history. What are the benefits of this? The first is that when people are forced to reflect on their own personal history, the introspection helps them unravel why they're predisposed to be a certain way. Opening opposition is a bit uncharitable because they claim that therapists will now be changed and now therapists will be like social activists. We are clashing directly with opening government's premise. We claim that access is much harder on their side when people already have explanations and are provided solutions. Therefore, people on our side are more likely to seek professional mental health because they understand that the cause are individualized and there's no other way for them to uncover the reason why they're miserable unless they go to a therapist that is specific to them and gives them individualized help. What are the benefits of this? The first is that we push them away from bad online resources that are often generic or give terrible pop psychology advice. The reason is because they know that the cause is something personal to them and that online resources can never explain it in a way that's nuanced and individualized to them. But the second is that this means that there's a higher likelihood that they even get professional help and get medicine in the first place because there's no generic explanation that's provided to them. The conclusion is this: we get better understandings of the nuance of mental health issues and how your life and history has affected it. Rather than a social prescription that says that you're Asian and therefore you should suffer in this way, people, you have a social prescription that says that certain demographics, because they suffer from social-economic conditions, ought to suffer in a certain way. We give them specific and individualized explanations for the misery. For all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to that speaker. Now I invite the government whip to give the last speech in the government this week. Here.
Three, two, one. in a world where already free will is a conception that is pushed upon people, furthering narrative that people are to blame, that people have the power to change their narrative, even though when they can change their disease, they're blaming themselves for this, I think this is the worst world to live in. Few things on this. Firstly, generally, I'll comment on opposition bench. Note that most of the personal experiences that you have are caused by societal narratives. Your father beating you is caused by the patriarchy that was imposed on them or the times that they lived. The reason why, for example, you were discriminated against and you felt actively shit, or for example, you were attacked by the police, is not because you did something specific, but because people grew up in a time where they are forced certain narratives upon them. This means that personal events that happen to you, such as trauma, such as people how they just interact with you, are something that also is impacted by the societal narratives, right? So it's easier for you to conceptualize and more so understand and get comfort from this, right? You understanding that your father left not because he hates you, but because of societal narratives, for example, for men to be stronger, to maybe just do something else, is something that gives you more comfort to deal with the personal trauma that you have, which I think is highly impactful. First, on and what they generated, which I genuinely think is absurd. Firstly, on therapy approaches and how professionals deal with. I think, as I asked my pre-Y, there are a lot of normal incentives to professionals to act in good ways, right? They spend years upon years in education where they deal with how people should be treated. And secondly, I think they have a monetized incentive for them to do this in a good way, right? Because if you give someone a solution and it doesn't work for them, they won't come back to you, right? Your job and your well-being as a professional depends on you giving good therapy to people. But secondly, I would say that if a certain professionals deal in their own specific bubbles where they have the nuances of how to deal with people, even if it's a societal narrative, they never provide professionals who buy into it in the way that it is. But secondly, though, I would generally say that they start to say you won't opt into therapy because you believe you cannot change your environment. And no, OG don't respond to this in a sufficient way. I think there are two things to note about this. One, they say you try to change your environment and this is bad because it's hopeless for you to do so. I'm unsure why this is something that you cannot do or whether it's bad. I think people mobilizing more to change shit is actively good, right? Because it gives them at least some further push to make the changes that you talk about and that will help you, right? It is better for you to have that, for example, to have more money in a specific situation will likely help you more to deal with your personal trauma. But secondly, I think that people already normalize the idea that you cannot always change the big things, right? In terms of politics, you see that, for example, not always will you be able to change, but at least you have some idea of what caused it and you can not put the blame actively on yourself. Because imagine this, when you're in a depressive episode or you're about to get into this, you're already spiraling in terms of guilt and saying that you're bad. People do self-harm because they believe they're the ones to blame and that they deserve to suffer for the trauma that they have. Their world is what actively feeds into this, because when people are not rational, people are emotional in depressive episodes, they tend to miss the nuance, right? And get into those worse alternatives where the perception of their trauma is something that they will blame upon themselves. I think it's better for them to find an alternative to blame something else in order to cope with this mental illness in the future. Now, secondly though, let's weigh this out, right? I think there's a few things to do. First of all, whether or not therapy is effective. I would say therapy is more effective once you can understand the reasons behind the personal things that happen. You cannot understand why your father beat you. You can just say, oh, this happened to me. But when you understand that your father beat you because of societal narratives or the general different time that this person lived through, you can get the comfort that either one, there is some reason why this was done, or secondly, you can get the comfort to move on because you understand it better. Secondly though, I would say even if that's not the case, it's better for the specific people who are isolated in the areas where they believe that it's always them, that they are always the one to blame, to have the counterbalance, to be pushed to believe maybe it's the societal narratives and thus not get into a worse mental condition than they already were. I think this is more important because it deals with the individual personally. Whether or not they go to therapy is something that we cannot always control. Now, secondly on CO, I think what they give is very, very problematic for a few reasons. One, note that obviously there are many different societal reasons that impact different groups. This means you can justify, for example, rich people being depressed because of the pressure that they have from their families to succeed or from the environments that they exist that have a lot of pressures for them to get depressed. I think more so, if this is the narrative, you get more research about the different kinds of socioeconomic factors that impact you, that gets you the ability to be more nuanced in your takes, right? They never prove why you have a dominant narrative of specific type of research in which only poor people can have mental illnesses. I think this is fucking absurd. Secondly though, I think that what you have to say is that, oh, all Asians will be depressed and something like this. I think firstly, people are not so fucking dumb to not understand that there are a lot of different demographics within one big demographic, right? You have, for example, when you have women, you have poor women, you have middle class women, you have women of color, you have women from different backgrounds. I think people can differentiate the different types of groups that you have and not put blanket discrimination upon them. But secondly, I'm unsure why you say, oh, if you're Asian, you're necessarily depressed, because you can be an exception to the rule, right? Most of the time, you cannot really know if this is the case, but in the case where the more vulnerable people who are actually Asian, who are actually depressed, can get the justification of why they are so, and society can be more lenient towards them. This is the case. If people perceive that you are to blame for your own disease, they will behave in a worse way towards you, right? They will actively not validate your experience and say, well, if it's individual caused by you, you have the power to change it. Before I continue, opening.
Both sides have movies that depict mental issues. Their side focuses on how poverty causes it, whereas our side depicts the personal nature of therapy sessions and tells you that you're not the only one whose parents abuse
Look,
you.
I think that again, you can justify the reason for why this is something important is because specific people, sorry, let me restart. The personal experiences that you have, sure, they impact you, but they are caused by the societal narratives. Even if so, I think the most important group in this debate is the group that doesn't realize that there are other pushes for them, right? And can actively self-blame themselves to an extent that their depression gets worse. Lastly, on OG. One, not that we impact more people because not all people can access therapy because it's fucking expensive. I think we control how people perceive their illnesses when they're the most vulnerable and cannot access this help. This is more important. So more people are more vulnerable. But secondly, I would say that we are prior to them in the sense that if people perceive their illness to be something that they cause or something, and we explain why this is likely to be the case, they cannot get into therapy, and more so, the therapy won't be effective because no matter what your professional says, if you still believe you're to blame, if you still believe that it's all because of you, therapy will never work. So it doesn't matter if you opt into therapy more. This is something that is necessary for their case to succeed. Overall, I believe that even if there are certain narratives, we prove to you why there's a pressure for people to blame themselves and to be individualistic. This is an important narrative to have in society. Very proud of those.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much to that speaker. And now I invite the opposition with the final speech of this debate. Hear, hear.
Ateneo.
Let's start by cleaning up the surface level harms in this debate. They claim that neurodivergent people will blame themselves in a myriad of other these types of small harms. This is easily mitigated by the motion because we assume a preference that the actors driving the motion, i.e. social movements in medical institutions, they have equal capacity to tell people that it's not their fault, is because of a genetic predisposition or you historically having been exposed to a particular factor in your life. Now let's deal with the crux of opposing government's case. We think it's insulting for CG to suggest what is or isn't comforting for people who need to seek mental health the most, and that having something to blame is the end-all be-all solution to solve these types of conditions. Let's start by engaging in their best case, where they somehow manage to close the empathy gap and they get more discussion about how external factors affect neurodivergent individuals. I want to give a quick reality check because CG themselves concedes that the vast majority of people are neurotypical and cannot relate to the nuanced experiences of those who do have mental health conditions. So the burden of proof on their side to prove that they do get these benefits is extremely high. And for them to achieve the kind of large-scale change and discourse that they want, that they think is empowering for these individuals, need a large opt-in from that neurotypical majority who they claim cannot relate to these individuals. Even if they do get opt-in from that neurotypical majority, we think there are three inherent problems. One, neurotypical people will crowd safe spaces meant for neurodivergent individuals because they're the ones who get to make the big decisions. They control the media and political will over big institutionalized systems, so they get a premium. We think this is bad because then neurodivergent individuals are afraid of criticizing the neurotypical majority for them to get the solutions they want because they think this is the best they're going to get considering that there is a neurotypical majority. But secondly, the solutions you're likely to get on their side of the house will be tokenistic because neurotypical people, especially those who cannot relate to those with nuanced mental health conditions, i.e. politicians who want to look good for the next election cycle while having tokenistic policies to help neurodivergent people, or the media who control larger narratives and have profit incentives, are not likely to go into the most comprehensive ways to address these types of issues. So you don't actually get to empower and give people the comforting narrative they want if it is reduced to these simplistic narratives. But lastly, we think the solutions on their side of the house will be as palatable as possible to that neurotypical majority if they think they are a key, large number of people to get these types of solutions. Because the people they are likely to negotiate with from those who do have mental health conditions will be those who are neurotypical passing, people who are have an easy time negotiating with the media. They're either going to not show the worst experiences of people with mental health conditions because they are afraid that the neurotypical majority will be turned off, that they won't get that discourse, or they're going to sell the worst parts of people who do have conditions by sensationalizing them on media, by exposing them to these types of things to get more awareness for those profit incentives. We think that these are inherent harms to closing the empathy gap and are guaranteed harms that give a false impression that there are solutions even if there aren't, so you don't actually get the comfort on their side of the house. But secondly, this also proves that they just don't get the empathy gap at all, because these are surface level discussions that don't empower the most vulnerable people they want. Moving on to opening government then. Opening government claims that average people find it hard to seek help because they cannot process introspection, and it is internally easier for them to bury it under the rug. This is exactly why the most vulnerable people on their side of the house who want to seek help are reduced to their most outward characteristics. They tell you that it is because you're a woman of color, not because you're a victim of intergenerational trauma from being an immigrant that caused you to feel these types of things in the first place. So these people's lived experiences are dismissed because it's easier to blame structural concepts of exploitative capitalism or abstract concepts of racism rather than recognize how you as an individual process these types of concepts. So OG's main mechanism of scale and mass buy-in work against their benefits because that makes it harder for individuals to recognize intersectional identities when everyone else reverts to headline labels like race and gender that are easier for large groups of individuals to revert to. We think that's a bad thing. But even if you do get the access on opening government, if you buy their reasoning, we think that you as a person have optimism bias if you seek support because you only seek help if you think you can possibly help or you can be included in these discussions. We think then that the conversations on government are simplifying the existing discussions on these societal factors. So you are more likely to believe that you have already recovered from your experience because you have a template of societal factors that you're able to revert to. So you believe that you have already recovered or have gotten better. This means that people have worse conditions because they believe that they don't need meds or therapy anymore, when in reality they do because they don't get the nuanced discussions on their side of the house when they have a broader subject to revert to rather than discover the inherent experiences that individuals do have. And even if you don't buy these responses and believe OG that they get increased awareness, note that the mechanisms for awareness exist on both sides. For example, social movements, and the counter reasons for these are also symmetric, i.e. people who are apathetic because they cannot relate to these people are also symmetric, so their benefits don't lie in this debate. I'll take you opening.
On both sides, some people don't think you're a narrative. They do not prove why their groups are better on their side of the house. However, we better achieve critical mass, which normalizes also for minorities, also for rich people, down the line when more people think this is better, you don't have a comparative.
No, we do. Kavan proves it. First, we don't preemptively exclude individuals by creating oppression Olympics that force them to justify the oppression they face relative to broader structures that people already accept as a majority. But secondly, you don't get that critical mass for the reasons I explained. They are largely symmetric, or you have a neurotypical majority who goes against you, or even if you do get support from that majority of individuals, you don't get discussions that are actually helpful to the most vulnerable individuals you claim to protect. Because you have guaranteed harms and speculative benefits, government bench is out. Let's deal with opening opposition then, where they claim it's hard to solve societal issues and personalized therapy is better because people can control themselves. We think this is extremely uncharitable because we agree that therapists will look for common trends and patterns, but it does not mean that they will always tell people they are powerless against these structures and they cannot beat capitalism. We think OO is very uncharitable. The CO nuance is far better because we assume that therapists have good intentions and will still help you overcome how you process these societal factors. We agree with OG, but the delta in this debate with Kavan's speech is that we prove that even with these individualized approaches, the conclusions of these sessions will revert to that societal factor. The way people process their conditions is not ground up on their side of the house. They build on existing studies, on existing research and discussions on societal factors and build their individualized understanding from there, again, because this is a societal factor, you are less likely to capitalize on intrinsic intersectional identities that the most vulnerable individuals have. Let's use this nuance that wins us over OO to beat OG and CG. Kavan proves to you that you're more likely to gloss the intersectional identities of individuals, that the visceral threat of police brutality to kill your life seems worse than just workplace discrimination where white people talk over you as a minority woman, or the oppression Olympics, that how come another immigrant person of color can process these structural factors better than me, even though we have the exact same circumstances. So we weigh out the CO extension through this by proving that the people who suspect they need to seek mental health who are not
standing on their side of the house. For all these reasons, oppose.